Rosa, I will ask you just to wait a few seconds before you start. It's just the time for Zoom to connect to the participants, okay?
Okay, so you let me know, or
You can just count to 10. It's not that much, but I think it's okay.
okay. Thanks.
Just for the participants don't hear me speaking with you.
Okay.
Muy bien, gracias.
Buenos días a todos.
Good morning to everybody, all of us who are in the English continent. And we give you a welcome to this webinar that is organized by the World Bank. And we are going to start it with these special procedures for the micro and small companies. We thank for the opportunities that both institutions have given us the opportunity to work. And this is the opportunity, Andres Martinez, for the introduction of the topic of the World Bank and the importance that these topics have. I present Andres Martinez, who is a senior specialist from the World Bank. He is a lawyer for more than 20 years now, the corporate law in the solvency matters. He has been working in Latin American countries as well as Europe and Asia, and judicial matters on debt. Before working for the World Bank, he has been working in many other topics. Andres is insolvency matters for the World Bank, and he has been working in many other positions too. Andres, you have the floor. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and I am very pleased to be here with many other friends in this panel. I am going to show you very quickly some slides just to present the stage. As we have been discussing, the panel will be presented in Spanish, but para
interpretation, there should be a button there. But I think the panel, the moderator decided that the panel will be in Spanish, so we'll have it in Spanish. Dicho esto,
after saying these words, I will continue in Spanish just to make a brief introduction of these small and medium-sized companies. As you know, in the World Bank, we are focusing for several reasons. Mainly today, we can say that there are three reasons. The first is the key importance for the key global development of the medium and small enterprises, and obviously today with the pandemic and the great crisis that we have had in health matters, that has affected in a considerable manner the small and medium-sized enterprises, and obviously for many other reasons too that are obviously very clear to everybody, and that has affected many other sizes. And the insolvency laws, the way they stand now, have been thought for large size companies. In the US, there is a new law for medium and small size enterprises, and many other countries are also considered. In Spain, we have proposals with other friends that we have here. This is something that has been been taken into account very strongly. The micro and medium and small size company are in 90% of the cases. We know that the panelists are going to be presenting the specific numbers of Mexico and Peru. It is going to be very interesting to see the details in each one of these countries. But quite frankly, the reality that the emerging countries, most of the works carried out are prepared by these type of companies. 7 of 10 works of jobs. The fact is that after the pandemic, one expects right from the start, one said, well, there is going to be a lot of cases of insolvency. But in the case of Mexico and Peru, this is quite frankly disproportionate, because in Mexico, it has been surprising the low number of cases. And Dario and Luis, let's see what they will tell us about this. But at the time, it was said that an avalanche of cases could happen after the pandemic. But there are three things happened. The first, the fiscal stimulus, but the second was the many countries, they had moratoriums, so suspended the rights of the creditors, and the bank themselves, as well as the creditors, have been very cautious and did not want to be to go to big scales. But the patience can also stop. And all countries with whom I have been talking and that we work with say that the crisis is very far from ending. And the response to this, if there is going to be an avalanche of bankruptcies, is not very clear. Perhaps it is not going to be of a very large number of bankruptcies, and we have to wait and see. What are the large and medium-sized companies going to do? We do not know. As we said, the laws of insolvencies are not ready to deal with the specific cases. And this is something that in the audience like you is in large cases, sometimes is not really very clear, but the incentives as well as the formalities of the micro and small companies, enterprises are very surprising. And this says that it is very difficult for them to fulfill the requirements. Well, the creditors do not pay attention really to this type of enterprise, and those that have a specific point to approve the restructuring and recovery plan, well, you know, the creditor is passive, so it's very difficult to solve it. And to access to financing during the period of insolvency, it's a very difficult task. And even with insolvency for this type of companies, during a period of insolvency to have this type of rounds, it's almost impulsency to the restructuring process. It demands, obviously, the financing and perhaps some other procedures of financing for these type of companies. Well, then you have an overlapping and so overlapping of the insolvencies of the business and the regime. So when we talk of micro companies, of personal credits and nobody or otherwise, and the topics of no assets for insufficient funds, especially of small, because who is going to pay the monitors or whoever else but the professionals themselves, but that are participating in these cases. But finally, as we are going to see in the next slides, in the principles to decide on this, but the realities, you have the micro enterprises and the responses to these problems. And it was decided to allow them to choose what to do. We are talking about micro and small enterprises, and to simplify things, the simplified regimes or accelerated, as Dario said previously. But, it's now we are going to see a little bit the task of the World Bank in this area. in the 1917, the report on the MSMEs, where we stressed some of these deficiencies in the systems and that the insolvencies laws didn't seem to solve. In 2018, we prepared the reports and the proposals of the treatments in an open one. And finally, in April of 2021, we made a sort of amendment and upgrading of updating, better say, where we published new principles for insolvency. I can obviously give you a link of the chat. And to finalize, the principles, updated principles, what they say is something generic, and it's going to develop in a consistent manner. But basically, we are referring to the access, the much cheaper, more technological, minimizing the formalities, because there are enormous 5 audited balance sheets, etc. But you know, that cannot be really applicable. You have to have alternatives that are really interesting and acceptable to the creditors, a simple and ordinary way, so that it is acceptable and with regards to the acceptance and approval for the middle because it has to be, this is acceptable, it can be an implicit approval. Obviously, we demand that it has to be an voting and approval, an implicit vote approval, to go to the details of it. And the debtor has to be in possession of the business, and at the final of the process, the discharge of good faith for the natural person entrepreneur, so that they continue contributing, because otherwise this wouldn't be, they continue paying the old debts, it is not going to continue working and contribute to the economy. Or they are going to go to looking for black work and not contributing to the formal economy. These are very important because our judge today, and I'm talking to the judge of all, referring to the judge of all our countries, they're very busy with big cases, and nevertheless, most of the cases that they have in hands are the small cases, and the value that they might add is very small. So we have to think about these specific cases. And well, you know, some organizations that are more in charge of the stages of the companies that may refer to this economy. And with these words, I thank you very much. I return the floor to the panel, and I'm extremely interested in hearing to my colleagues what have to say. Thank you, Andres. I also want to tell you that we are going to have some time for question and answers later on, and we can use it now or at the bottom of your screen to have the opportunity to answer them all at the end. Let us start with a panelist, and I thank Andres, and I ask you to put the principles for the insolvencies and the rights of the creditors for all those of the audience who can see them, because in all our countries, and as we are going to see, we have absolutely nothing that is properly regulated for micro and small company, because all of this is going to be very useful for a good principle for regulating these procedures. I am going to start presenting our panelists. I am going to start with the Peruvian panelists. We have Fernando Martino, who is a lawyer with corporate law, and insolvency from Peru and finance and corporate law by the University of Sun. For more than 20 years, he has been an expert in insolvency and creditors. He has been the technical roles of insolvency and how his apartment on Marino and lawyers. Guillermo Puelles is a partner of Rodrigo Diaz y Merano and the Catholic University of Peru and solvency and insurance, airline insurance and the corporate law. He's a member of insolvency and he is a law teacher in the university, and obviously he I had the privilege that he in Nápoles and it gave me a lot of trouble to understand what his writings. I present also to you Daria Oscos from Mexico. He is extremely experienced in restructuring, reorganization, and insolvency law, international dealings, and he's a lawyer that has taken all the knowledge of foreign laws and sentences in Mexico. He's an arbitrator, and he's also the National Institute of Insolvency and the Committee for International Law, known as UNCITRAL of disputes, among other things, of National Bar Association, as well of Insolvency in International, and has been a professor of many Mexican universities. And finally, last but not least, as it is said in English, we have Dr. Luis Mechan. Is a researcher, and in Mexico for 30 years he has been the lawyer of the Central Bank of Mexico and secretary of the same bank and the Bankers Association, and during 9 years he has been the federal specialist of mercantile law, and he has been the president of regulators of insolvency. He is also these many international associations. He represented Mexico in UNCITRAL and the central bank. He has been a representative and he is the author of several specialized books. As you see, we have the first tier representative on this panel, and we will start. They are not going to be individual panelists, but we are going to have a chat among them, and we'll have questions and they will answer with their opinion. We are going to use a premise. Different to the previous webinar, Chile and Colombia have special for micro and small enterprises. Argentina has their own laws and exempt them from certain rulings. And in Peru, we have absolutely nothing regulated and the characteristics of these companies. Therefore, this is a challenge of achieving this regulation, and we are going to focus on the relevance of this topic and some essential topic and what has to be covered with this regulation. Let us start about talking about the importance, and I would like to talk, Luis Manuel, if you could tell us about the percentage of enterprises or micro and small enterprises in Mexico and how they contribute to the economy in Mexico. Thank you very much, Rosa Maria, for giving me the floor. Obviously, sorry, I would like to share my screen, but I seem to have some technical difficulty. It doesn't really matter. I won't do so. No, but we can see it. We see you. Oh, perfect. Then let me do it. Let me just increase its size. Thank you very much. The International Solvency Institute and the World Bank for having invited me to this meeting. I am very pleased to share with you that have joined me for many years with joint work and activities, especially in the case of the World Bank. I have had the fortune of working that and with Andres, answering the questions. I have to make a presentation because I have to give you numbers, and it is much easier to show you than to talk about them. In Mexico, the micro, small, and medium-sized companies at the end of 2020 or the a year when the pandemic started, represented 52% of the GDP. That's the size of these companies. The calculation was that we have these 4.9 million of the MY. You see in the first column at the left, the blue one, that the largest number, the total number, and then the other three columns show the medium, the small, and the micro companies. The curious thing about the Mexican situation is the majority, especially the micro enterprises, are informal than formal. They are not regulated, and this is one of the topics that are essential to think about the regulation, the solvency. They have to become formal. Look, that 4.9 million, the third part, were practically formal, and all the remaining part, almost 70%, informal. The occupation of the first people represents between micro, medium, and total, represent 47% of the enterprise. And there is interesting to note what happened with the pandemic, because this gets us closer to the aspect that we are studying today. 3.9 survived. We lost 1 million companies with the pandemic during the first stage, but nevertheless, another 619,000 regenerated. We still have a deficit between 300 to 400,000 that were lost forever in absolute numbers. That faced the problems with an enormous deterioration of these companies. From all those companies that closed, there were more formal ones than the informal ones. This seems to be logical, because from the informal companies, 5.6 closed their doors, and from the establishments that survived, the fourth part are formal only. All of this allows us to put us into the structure of the problem that sees the micro and small companies. I believe that with this data, I have told you about the problem that we are living in our country today. Excellent. Thank you very much. I will ask Fernando if he could tell us what is the scenario in Peru. Thank you very much, Rosa Maria, and for the opportunity to the organizers for this kind of invitation, because it's always good to be participating. I don't know if curiously or not, but the numbers are very similar to those that we just heard of. In Peru, these figures tell us the number of enterprises, the micro and small and medium is 98%. A number of enterprises is not obviously a number of volume of business. This implies that in this economy, the micro and medium and small companies, we have 85% of the working force. Is similar to Mexico. Also, the informal component segment of these medium and small enterprises, approximately 85% of these enterprises are informal, and on the working job post, you 77 and 72 are informal posts. That means that they does not pay, does not grant all the social benefits, or all the taxes are not paid. Very similar to what happens in Mexico. Nevertheless, this world of micro and small and medium enterprises in Peru until 2019, with gathering the remarks of Andres, it is a portion that is really important for the Peruvian enterprise and economy. Very briefly, just to focus this, we have three categories: micro, small, and medium enterprises. The categories are defined by number of workers and invoicing level. If you exceed that volume, they go to the next category, and it is a medium enterprise. They go to the general regime. Very quickly, I would like to say that a micro enterprise has income of 160,000. It is a small company. If its annual income 1,800,000, and it is a medium company if it invoicing it doesn't exceed $2.5 million. This is very quickly in Peru, the results, and I am very pleased to answer any queries that you may have. Thank you very much, Luis Fernando. As Andres said during his intervention, at least in Mexico, we've had some problems with the procedures and the number of mercantile procedures that we have. This webinar, specifically, we are going to be discussing the medium, micro, and small enterprises. We're trying to see what efforts we are doing to regulate these enterprises. I would like to ask you something. In Mexico, for this procedure of insolvency and ruling for insolvency, it is in a recent date is the pre-insolvency, with all the problems that we have lived through the pandemic. Many countries have gone, and international organizations have made a recommendation, and the European Union recommends that there is a pre-solvency recommendation, especially importance in the companies that they can resist a much shorter period of time than a big company. What do you think? Dario, could you please tell us what is your opinion if you think that access to this type of procedure for micro, small, and medium, so it has to be an early access? What do you think? Thank you.
I would like to thank the World Bank and the International Insolvency Institute for the organization of the series of panels on the situation of small, medium, and large enterprises in Latin America. This is a very important topic. I believe that more than ever, I am passionate about insolvency, and I would like to talk about two aspects. First of all, this issue of our representative from the World Bank, Fernando Martinez, his doubt about Mexico. Why this issue of the insolvency regimes in Mexico? I'd like to remind you of 1982, systemic crisis, devaluation of the peso, control of the exchange rate, and the banks becoming state-owned, and the agenda to solve the financial crisis at the time was through government restructuring of support through the Bank of Mexico, the Ministry of Finance, OCA, and the Bank of Mexico. There was a large amount of medium and large companies which were insolvent at the time. And so many bankruptcies were filed at the time under this law of payments not being going into effect. And with this regime presenting the petition or filing for bankruptcy or insolvency was a mandatory filing, because otherwise they would fall into the fraudulent bankruptcy filing. And then 10 years later, the bank crisis of 95. We cannot hear you. I don't know if the others can hear you. Dario, I think you have muted your microphone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, I apologize. I'm referring to the second stage in Mexico, 1995, the second crisis in Mexico, where the whole banking system went bankrupt in Mexico. And the crisis broke down most of the micro and small and medium-sized companies. What was the solution? And support to banks and government support, and even a series of bankruptcy filings came down. There were 3 courts, special courts created in Mexico, and there were not so many procedures at the time. And the procedures increased, and payments were suspended after the 90s. That was a problem. And the provocation was the law for mercantile trade issues. At the time, the presentation of cases here voluntary, because this is not mandatory, 800 suits, less than 40 a year. Why? I would like Fernando Martinez to know about what's happening. That's horrible because of many historical reasons. After this rescue state, it was like the inspection issues. It never, ever there was an insolvency culture in Mexico. Obviously, the products, the bank products, are the ones that demand most support and credit. They are the ones that are abundant and fill the courts. And answering your question, Rosa Maria, I'm about to conclude. What happens? Of course, you need to have an effective regime, a simple one, a voluntary one. And this is to protect, in these situations, the organized settlement or the bankruptcy. under the principles of the World Bank. And they are part of the UNCITRAL model law on insolvency, the simplified model for small and medium-sized companies. But careful, meeting the real needs of statistics in Mexico, we need to treat differently small, micro, and medium-sized companies. The medium-sized companies are closer to the large-sized companies. I'm going to continue with Q&A later on, so because I'm quite late. Thank you, Dario. Guillermo, could you tell us what you think about this access? I do not know about access in Peru. Can you tell us a bit about this? In Mexico, we have so many problems with access to procedures. What is your suggestion? If we are focusing on micro and small companies. Thank you. Thank you for remembering this book. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the World Bank and the International Insolvency Institute for the invitation. And I'd like to greet all those of you who are here today with us. Now, answering your question, in Peru, there's a major doubt on the line of what Dario mentioned now. There was this snubbing or closing their eyes in face of this reality. The situation of small debtors, those with consumption credit, individuals who do not have access to large credits, different from small and medium-sized companies who have access to support and encourage productivity. They have some fiscal support and encouragement, but there was nothing for this case. They are abandoned, so to speak, under the framework of insolvency law in Peru. So practically speaking, micro and small companies are subject to the same framework of large companies, and that does not make sense. This is like was mentioned in Mexico. There are very few processes for the support of micro and small companies. And if I go on the line of your question, there is no system for the micro and small companies, and they have difficulty to enter the process. They need to meet a series of requirements to have access to prepare financial statements, assets, and liabilities, and spreadsheets, something which makes it difficult for them. Of the 98% of the Peruvian companies, we know that they are small and micro companies. 85% are informal. They have no spreadsheets. They have no formal accounting systems. So they are totally out of the system. Unfortunately, currently, we are spending much time to help them. And entering this bid in Peru is difficult. To obtain the automatic stay and fulfill all the requirements, it takes too long. So it is an unfortunate system for all the players. The large companies are suffering this equally, but even less for the small and medium-sized, because the lack of an appeal system to have access to this credit is unfortunate. And when they do, it's too costly. And they have to fulfill a series of rules that make it even more costly. So, of course, in Peru, it would be essential to have a specific regime for micro, small, and medium-sized companies. And this regime should be decentralized and allow for immediate access because of the large number of companies. It should be processes that could begin in a notary's office with automatic immediate stay and have the ability to have 3 months period in which their estate is protected and they have access to negotiate with their creditors. And under this formula, they would be able to be under a mechanism which is truly useful. But in addition to that, Peru has a second problem. And here I believe I'm going to close now so we can encourage more discussion. In Peru, there's no second chance or discharge or first start. There is no legislation. We have one size fits all system. And in the past, there was a simplified system for larger companies. And it was not well implemented. So we have this one size fits all, which was built for large-sized companies where access is difficult, and it does not fit medium companies, but there's no fresh start and discharge. In the case of large companies, it's not a problem because if they are bankrupt and they are settled, okay, that's it. But in the case of the individual entrepreneur, the capital is human capital, and entrepreneurs need to go on developing their activities. So the inexistence of the fresh start is a huge problem to allow for the insolvency regime, which does meet the needs of the economy. So this is important. The discharge, I believe you mentioned it, it has to do with a way of formalizing companies. It could be an accountability system. I discharge you if you have your accounting system, if you are more formal, and then you create a vicious circle. But you need to have efficient, quick access at low cost, allowing for access. And this is non-existent in Peru. Excellent, thank you. Of course, we have the same situation in Mexico, as Dario said. We have very few procedures, access is complicated. Our judges do not like trade issues because there's discharge and we don't have procedures for individuals. So the path is a long one and difficult one. As you said, the solution is considering the needs and deficiencies of our procedures. What can we do, as Dario said, and as Guillermo said as well? We need to have accelerated, fast systems with simpler access. The recommendations by the World Bank, well, they need to be off court. And usually the judicial systems and suits are complex, lengthy, and costly. So how feasible is it to have extrajudicial processes? In Peru, there's Indecope taking care of this. We have IFECOM in Mexico. They simply keep a registry of specialists. But I believe IFECOM is not being used as much as it could. Could we attribute them, assign a more important role to them? We have alternative measures for dispute resolution. Is that a solution? What do you think? And I would like to ask first Fernando from Peru. Thank you, Rosa Maria. Well, I believe that the situation has been outlined, as has been said about Mexico and Peru. What we need, well, I believe, based on the principles Andres pointed out to in Peru, that would be the foundations. The last one mentioned, delegating. In the institutional framework, we need to begin by decentralizing processes. And this is certainly one of the problems we have, in addition to costs and access, but we need to decentralize. In Peru, one of the major issues that the economy is facing and the country in general, is this centralization. Everything happens in the capital. But that doesn't mean there are no other centers, important centers for the economy in the country. So the first concept, which I believe should occur in Peru, is to decentralize, to get out of Indecopi, this monopoly, and try to consider options. I don't know about bankrupt authorities or mediators, but what would need to do is to open up doors and allow for alternative measures for solving the crisis. We've had experiences in the past of this type of decentralization. We had a few years ago a procedure which was considered with the notaries' offices and the copy also. And today, although it's not really active, but Endecopy could delegate its roles and attributions. Several years ago, there were agreements with the trade associations, chambers of commerce, in large cities of Peru, at least. That would be a beginning. But that would be the starting point, I believe, delegating. And no longer focus on the large companies, the large creditors. Well, okay, go on focusing on them because they are doing it well. But what about this small and micro and medium-sized companies? They need alternative solutions. And here, I would like to use 2 more minutes to mention the following. When we talk about this micro and small sized companies, the first thing when you think of when you enter the companies is that the traditional business is a small one. If they are selling sands or tiles or importing masks to be sold in shops. But this world is not the only business dynamic. We have this whole new thing, which is the startups today, which are presenting a different issue to how we would deal with insolvency, because there is only current asset. There is no inventory. There is almost no facility. They are virtual companies very often. So someone was mentioning this. In this type of business, they invest on the team. They invest on human resources, but not on an asset. So what has value? It's the brand, it's the trademark, it's the know-how, it's the domain name. So this whole thing needs to be incorporated in the new insolvency regime, because at least in the Peruvian one, it's very much based on the traditional way of doing business. Fixed assets, estate, and capital. But this whole world, which is being developed in the micro and small sized companies, which also deserve attention from the point of view of promotion and development, but also from the point of view of meeting the needs of a bankruptcy or insolvency situation. Thank you, Fernando. Luis Manuel, what do you think about this? Your microphone is on mute.
Listo, ahí está ya. Gracias. Como tú dices, no tenemos un
As you
procedimiento de
said,
este
we
tipo
do not have
en México.
such a procedure
¿Cuál sería el
in
camino que
Mexico.
usted sugeriría? Uno,
What is my
me
suggestion?
gustaría
Well,
que
first of all,
usáramos
we
los
should use
procedimientos y los documentos que ha trabajado Uncitral
procedures and
en
documents
el
used by
grupo 1 de trabajo,
Uncitral
hablando del
and the
registro de las micro y
working
pequeñas
group number
empresas
one,
de
talking about
egresos, como el
registration of
segundo de los
micro and small
documentos
companies,
relativo a la
and the
posible
second document talking
conformación
about
de un
the
instrumento
potential configuration
corporativo
of
societario.
a
Y en el tercer
corporate
grupo que sería de
vehicle.
Uncitral,
And on the fifth
el
group of
procedimiento de
Uncitral,
insolvencia para
the
este tipo de
insolvency regime
empresas.
for
El
these
documento
micro and
está
small
por ser
companies. The
terminado en
document
septiembre
is about to
seguramente.
be concluded in
Poco
December,
falta,
I believe.
lo poco
We
que
will
falta
certainly
falta
conclude
menos.
it.
Entonces
There's
adoptamos
still just a little to be
las
done.
mejores prácticas de todo el
So
mundo.
the best practices from all over the world are collected there.
Micro y pequeñas industrias que cada país
What is
determine.
micro and
Y qué
small companies?
importante
That should be
aportación nos
defined
acaba de
by
hacer
each
Fernando cuando
country.
menciona las
And Fernando
startups,
just
los
mentioned the
unicorns y
startups,
todos este tipo
the
de empresas
unicorns, and all this
que están
new type
surgiendo.
of
Unitral está
companies.
trabajando hoy en día
Unitwa is
en un
working
documento de
today
los digital
on
assets.
the
Esto va
digital
a ser
assets.
fundamental
This is going to
pensando
be
en el futuro
essential due
del
to the
negocio.
new
Respecto
point of
a las
view of
procesalizaciones
business.
del procedimiento,
And talking about
yo creo
the
que sí hay que buscar
debureaucratization of
preventivas.
procedures, well, yes, we do
Como
need to
pregunta,
seek
¿IFECOM
preventive
va a
measures. And
ocuparse de
IFECOM,
ser el vehículo?
could it
Yo
become
pienso que sí. Yo
this
pienso
vehicle?
que
Well,
podría
yes, I
cubrir muchas
do.
más
I do believe
temporadas
it
que
could
tiene
fulfill
desde luego
many more
un
roles.
cambio legal.
First of all, we need
Si
a
uso
legal
aplicación
change,
una
and we need to
reglamentación,
use
el
a piece
IFECOM
of
tiene un
regulation that
miembro
IFECON
clave, que es la
has,
creación de oficinas en
which talks about the
lugares
creation
de la
of
descentralización que
workshops
mencionaba
and
Fernando, que
offices
en Colombia ha
around the
producido tan
country,
buenos resultados
providing for the
con
decentralization.
estas
In
últimas
Colombia, it
reformas que ha
did
habido.
show some results with the last
Ahora,
reforms.
el procedimiento, si lo
Well, the
desjudicializamos,
procedure, if you
en el caso de México,
de-judicialize it, in the
requeriría
case of Mexico,
si la
it would require the
desjudicialización
following. If it
necesitamos
is
incluso un cambio
complete,
constitucional,
we need a
porque
constitutional
llegará
change
un momento
because
en
there
que
will be
vamos
a
a
time
tener
in
que
which
hacer
the
una
judge
aprobación,
will
como
need
sucede
to
en
approve
Perú,
something as
como
has
sucede en
happened in
Venezuela,
Peru with
como
the
sucede en Colombia.
approval
Ahora, parcialmente es
processes
muy
that have been going
posible
on.
lograr
But
en
partially, you
México
can achieve that in Mexico
estos
partially.
procedimientos para micro y pequeñas
The
empresas pueden
procedures
manejarse en el
for
nivel
micro and small
administrativo
companies
con
can be
jueces,
managed
IFECOM
at the
u otras
administrative
instancias.
level, at
Colombia
IFECOM or
quizá, como
other
citaba Fernando, la
venues.
Cámara de
And
Comercio, y parece
in
que sí es
Colombia, there are the
lo que
chambers of
considera.
commerce, and they have been in charge of that
Establecer, yo
successfully,
creo que es
apparently.
fundamental la
And I
intervención o
believe
la
it is
inversión
essential to
en
have the
métodos
intervention and
alternativos de
incorporation of
aplicación.
alternative
Uno de los grandes
dispute
problemas que
resolution
enfrentan los
measures.
procedimientos
One of the
es el
problems
costo
that
muy
increase
fuerte,
insolvency
son
problems
las
around the
demandas o
world
las luchas del
is
acreedor para que diga, a mí me
the
deben
creditor saying,
100
well,
y nomás
they
me
uh,
reconocen
owe
40,
me
y a la
100, they are
mala
only
un
acknowledging
fraude que se
40, and
retiene
then
y paga de
suddenly
más. Utilicemos los medios
that
alternativos para
becomes an
resolver
issue. Let's use
estos
alternative
conflictos.
dispute resolution
Esto es más o
measures.
menos la
I
visión que yo
think this is
tendría.
more or less what I have in mind
Podríamos pensar en
about
acercarnos
how we
al
can think of
procedimiento adecuado
an
para
adequate
tratar
procedure
micro y
to
pequeñas
deal
empresas en un
with
país
micro
que
and
hay que
small
tomar en
companies,
cuenta este
where, by
nuevo
the way,
fenómeno de
we need to
hacer
consider the
negocios
new
que prolifera
phenomenon,
en
the
todo
new
el
way of
mundo
doing
y como
business,
decía Fernando,
which is
con un
spreading all over the
servidor
world.
en casa
Because with
y una
a computer at
cuenta
home
abierta
and an account,
virtualmente
and it
puede
can be a
usted
virtual
ser
account,
multimillonario.
you can have a multi-millionaire business.
Al contrario, Ismael, muchas gracias a ti.
Yes, thank
En
you,
seguimiento a
Luis.
lo que comentaron, a lo que han comentado ustedes.
Now, on the line of what you just said,
Fernando o Guillermo
I don't remember if it was
hicieron
Guillermo or
mención
Fernando. Someone mentioned
cuando hablamos de las
a very
microempresas,
frequent
¿no? Que son los microempresarios.
thing that
En
happens. It
países
is
en los que hay una
with
alta
micro
informalidad,
businessmen. In
tenemos
countries where there is a high level of
empresas
informality, we
que
have
están
several
legalmente constituidos,
businessmen and women
no tienen una
who
estructura
are
jurídica distinta, no tienen el mismo nivel
informal. They do not
de
have
negocio y
a
está habiendo una confusión entre el
corporation,
patrimonio
and there
personal
is a
del
confusion
empresario
between the
con el
personal
de la empresa.
assets and the corporate asset. And we might add to that the fact that they are informal, they don't take their accounting seriously, they have less access to credit, so it's much more difficult for them to have access to a restructuring system because the restructuring organization needs the figures. And if the company does not have up-to-date accounting, that's an issue. That's a significant issue. As you have said so well, there is a high level of informality in our country. So what can we do to overcome these difficulties with these micro entrepreneurs where their personal and corporate assets are mixed up? We could tell the entrepreneur or those who gave them guarantees when the company is set up, but the assets are confused, they should be subject to a separation. How can we deal with the issues and prove the financial insolvency? So I'd like to hear your opinions. I'd like to give the floor to Guillermo first. Thank you, Rosa Maria. That's an interesting topic. It is one of the most frequently discussed topics around the world, where corporate versus personal assets and capital are being discussed in the case of micro and small companies. In Peru, our regulations do not have a clear line separating individual capital from corporate capital when they are considered insolvent. And that is because it would be desirable to be able to distinguish personal from corporate assets all the time. But in the reality, in Peru, what we see is, first of all, that personal assets are being used for the corporate. Very often they use their own homes, or part of the house is a shop open to the public, or it is the office of that company. It is an office and their home. The family car is the same car being used to render services. And in fact, the reaction on the part of the market when that happens, even when there are small companies, the reaction on the part of banks and creditors is that they provide a loan for the startup initially, and they consider not the corporate asset, which very often is pure debt and very few assets, but they use as guarantee the personal assets. So they provide a loan, but the guarantee is on the personal assets. So they are attracting the personal assets to make them answer for the corporate responsibilities. So micro and small entrepreneurs need to sign this guarantee personally for corporate responsibilities. So in the world of crisis, economical crisis of micro and small companies, the assets are mixed up. And apparently, in this situation, instead of trying to fight their reality by separating the assets, the solution is the one you just mentioned, attracting only or in parallel
And this obviously generates some controversy. Why? Because the creditor of the consumption credit, the bank that helped for the mortgage, that has absolutely nothing to do with the business, could be affected because it was attracted to this problem of the insolvency, of the bankruptcy. And that is why I believe that this is better even because the entrepreneur could include all this. And wherever there is a good faith discharge, and yes, it is true, in the law, in the Peruvian law, there, for example, the personal goods, they cannot be seized and they're excluded from being seized. And, you know, the cars, the tools, the working tools, etc. But the Peruvian law protects them from being seized, and the family assets that what can preserve them, and they cannot be seized like the family housing. So you can protect the minimum subsistence assets to allow that the recovery insolvency really shows what is the business assets and what are the family assets. This is very important. And in Peru, the individual entrepreneur is a natural person, and it has an individual as that makes it difficult really to distinguish the natural assets and the assets of a couple. And this makes it very difficult in a case of a bankruptcy. And the idea is to manage that the entrepreneur is not going to lose the condition. And there must be a mechanism of a very quick resolution with the creditors where there is a possibility of a discharge, and to start again with some rules so that they have a discharge, and once it is formalized, so that they have paid their taxes, etc., so that there is a goodwill entrepreneur like anybody else. They can fail in their business. And if we add to that a set of goods that cannot be seized, and we have a system that determines and arranges and recovery and reorganization for the creditors, because otherwise the entrepreneur will disappear. They doesn't pay. The reorganization is the basis, and this becomes a circle, a vicious circle. The credit, very few, very low access to credit, and the assets of these entrepreneurs are very low, and they have a real prime when they get this type of loan. I believe that the reflection goes a little bit in this direction. Thank you very much, Guillermo. What can you tell us, Dario, on the informality, the enormous quantity of informal companies that we have in Peru? Yes, I can really support what Guillermo has said. But I would like to take you all to think, going a step forward. When we look at the statistics that have been updated by COVID, and that there are some that have described the micro enterprises, and the number of enterprises and the birth of the enterprises, the death of the enterprises and what remains afterwards. Looked at 4,600,000 enterprises is 95% of the total establishments in Mexico. And of those 4,600,000, 2 million are uninformed, and they are classified with 4 million, up to 4 million pesos, and the small enterprises are to 4 to say 5 million pesos. So what should we do? I believe that we should establish a regime that permits something that is very simple, that let us forget that the regimes that stand today. There's something very important on the principles that the World Bank established. It has to be voluntary or compulsory, the access. You have to have a specific regime. And I believe that for the micro, it should be an integral system, a very simple one that has to be, we have to give a privilege to the mediation as an alternative system of settlement of disputes, and in order to emit a alternative way of solving or settling disputes. And the initiative that is almost for the approval, the School of Lawyers are ready for the conditions of not approving this legislation that is so urgent. We problem is to economic environment, the reality. There are some very important studies where everybody agrees. And UNCITRAL, the World Bank, we have to have a regime where it is an integral and universal one. The liabilities, the micro and the small, the big one too, all of them. The small one, you have to give a way of subsisting and respect and try to find to give those creditors that have a preference. And the small one and the micro entrepreneurs, they are family members and others, and the con concubinate and others. This is a very interesting subject, but I believe that in order to have an adequate insolvency for micro and small companies, you have to cover the reality that we have. And I would suggest a process in 2 stages, a very simple one that is extrajudicial and that you homologate it afterwards to give to the effectivities. One, this was incentivate the debtor, but also the creditors who would get efficient and quicker problem with all its liabilities. But nevertheless, according to the goods, obviously, one should find that in the universe of creditors in this regime. And for the universe of creditors, I would think all those workers, financiers, and suppliers, and that the cost for the individuals, fathers of families, and parents and family members, and solve all the problems. In 45 years of experience, my philosophy is to find that a settlement of dispute has to define and settle a dispute, and you find it a juridical tool that finds if this facility of a low cost, and you find one. But I also want to say that the micro enterprises have a different component, political, social, and economic, and has to have a different type of solution para government. And the big these concentration that Fernando was mentioning is extremely important. You can distribute the solution among the different institutions, state or federal. The tool exists, and we have the alternative Justin that has been extraordinarily efficient the arrangement outside of this courts, certified, even administrative authorities, that gives the character of a sentence that has of the things that have been judged and a problem. It is extremely interesting. All the components that we can organized and harmonized and fine-tuned so that it is a party between the debtor and the creditors, and that they can enjoy the banquet and love the dessert, and that beware the power in a moment of the party. This is the great power. We live it in the banking crisis in Mexico, a systemic crisis where the groups of the debtors, they with the banking system in Mexico. We had, unfortunately, the possibility on the three biggest systems, the really the financing, we blocked all the banking products in the country. Fortunately, we overcame it, not because of the Constitution or the Supreme Court, but all the support that we gave to the creditors and the support to the banking system. So this topic of the big and the micro enterprises that were indebted with a political of a great social and political power. And I'll tell you something. Last year, then before the greatest voting in a program for 60 million pesos. You only had to have a request, 25 million pesos. And then what? There was a great dispersion. Yes, it was an reaction, but it worked, and that was the condition, so that you had the access of 25 million person by people, but they had in social insurance. Yes, I believe that there are instruments and creative methods that maybe have a good result. It is incredible the weight, specific weight that the micro and small persons have in the creation of product and the GDP. But if we look at other programs and other status, how they interact, the micro with the small, the medium, and the large. And I am going to leave that for the next conference that we will have on these topics, because it's extremely important. But I invite you to reflect of this. You have to think about reality. And we have the other topic of this poverty, 50 million in extreme poverty. This is unacceptable. If there's something that we have to think, we have to give forward. And there is a big study on the Mexican organization to at least diminish from the informality to competitiveness to the micro, small, and focused on the small companies, that they are the ones that can be feasible, not with the micro companies. I do not know that we are in a fantasy of thinking that we can wear the same clothes. It is not the same. They are not one that stays and fits one and can fit the other. I can share this study, but it has interested, this topic has interested me a lot. It is a policy, as a strategic policy of a country and the world. The World Bank has showed you with the recommendation and studies on what is happening. And it is not a critic, it is a social crisis. And you know what they complain, the micro, the soul, and lack of security, and in the case of Mexico, enormous corruption generalized in all sectors. And this, obviously, we can discuss and chat for a very long time. Thank you very much. I don't want to extend any longer.
Muchísimas gracias, Darío.
Thank you very much, Dario.
Me gustaría hacer un recuento muy breve, ¿no? De las
Very good ideas.
este panel.
of all the good ideas that have been discussed on this thing. Yes, Dario has told us that we have to think about different clause for different things, access that in all countries, and that the creditors have different problems, and it is important to tell us so that have the procedures must be different. To talk about discharge so that those entrepreneurs can have a second opportunity and that we can have incentives because they have to be related with formalization to see this type of discharge. The centralization, because both countries, I believe, are very centralized. But at least Mexico is a very large country. We have to have or offer the companies that are throughout the country review the best practices that have UNCITRAL and the World Bank have published to think in the possibility that our admin entities have procedures and in an integrated, in as much as possible, that can be homologated in judicial entities. Quite frankly, I believe that this was a very good exercise. We have some questions, and before closing, I would like to give you a few minutes so that you can close and discuss these questions. And obviously, Andres is also very welcome if he wants to add something to a question. Aurelio has made several questions, raised several questions. The first question is quite long, and as nobody has, not everybody has a good question. A good question, and thanks to all the opponents. For simplified procedures as well as the recommendation of the World Bank and UNCITRAL for the position taken are imposing the designation of a professional who has a simplified process, while some authors have suggested and some countries as Spain to reduce the process you need and not as a supervisor. Express that expressly the creditors request him, and the producers what models that they believe is more desirable for the simplified procedure, the pure or supervisor that would monitor the procedure, or the model with a supervisor. I would like to, who would like to respond? Manuel? Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Aurelio, for the question. I send Aurelio a very warm hug. I believe that this is essential in order to make it attractive for any entrepreneur to go to the insolvency procedure. If we tell him that we are going to remove him, or even that we are going to place a sheriff there to control him, we are going to remove him. I believe that we have to remove this idea because we are going to scare him off. I do not know the case of Spain, but I believe that there is a large amount of ideas of Spanish expert in the field who have their hairs up. We are eating up their nails, thinking about a mediator helping them out. I believe how we have to handle this mediator, usually somebody who is conciliating, we are using the mediating media, who can act economic treatment, who is not very expensive. When the companies arrive at this stage, they do not really have extra money to pay a person. And you have to go to government agencies like Endicop or ISECOM Mexico, the superintendency that work in Chile and Colombia. They do not
el costo de esto. ¿De qué
increase
reducimos el costo?
exorbitantly
Pero
the
vamos a hablar de la
cost.
reducción del costo.
But let's
Yo
us
creo
reduce
que
the
deberían
cost.
hacer una
I would not
supervisión
think
como
about
se hizo en
making
el
a
proyecto
supervision
que
like the project of
está
Spain
planteando
is
y tiene alarmados a los concurrentes.
recommending and
Definitivamente
is
sería grato escucharlo.
scaring the people in Spain. That is my opinion. Thank you very much.
Guillermo también quiere. Sí, adelante.
Yes.
Muy brevemente sobre este tema,
Very briefly on this
Perú, por
topic,
ejemplo, cuando
in Peru, for example, due to the pandemic, we had a temporary procedure for the bankruptcy. We established the possibility of having a controller, but only in those cases where the majority of the creditors accepted and they thought that we would have a very small group. And in those cases that the creditors believed that there was sufficient reason of doubting or lack of transparency, or that the entrepreneur or any out of the debtors of the operations, and that one would need some controller. But the reality would not have such number of professionals. I believe the same would happen here with the larger number of benefit of the creditors that would not be feasible. So there would have to be other type of controlling mechanisms. It would not necessarily be a controller. And then, yes, I think that this would be important because in this type of cases is the human capital is the type of refinancing that would ensure the success of the process, and the sanction of the company wouldn't be not granting them the discharge or not interfering directly of granting it. I only wanted to mention this. Thank you.
Andrés, adelante.
Andres,
Muy rápidamente, hola Aurelio.
very
Buenas
quickly,
tardes.
hello Aurelio.
Tarde. No, bueno, a ver, creo que no es, creo que todas
I
estas leyes son
believe
recientes.
that all these laws are very
No hay
recent.
suficientes lecciones aprendidas. Yo creo que
We
lo que
don't
tenemos que
have
hacer en algunos
sufficient
países,
lessons
sin
learned.
dudas no va a
And
funcionar
obviously, in
ni
some
en
of
el
the countries, the resources they have, some of the countries mentioned,
costear
they
incluso
probably
parte de
cannot
procesos distintos.
cover the costs
Y esto, bueno,
mentioned.
creo que hay que
And
esperar
I
a
believe that
las
we have
lecciones
to
aprendidas,
wait
cómo esto
and
sucede.
see
Entiendo que
how
lo
the
que
lessons
dice
learned will
los
work. In
panelistas
principle,
es
I am in agreement with the
claro, tiene que
lessons
ir
learned mentioned by the panelists.
y no asumir que va a haber fraude.
And we do not have to believe that
Estamos
there's going to be any type of fraud, because if this happens, we are not legislating correctly. This is something I mentioned in general.
¿Qué sistemas institucionales
The
diferentes
institutional systems are so different. The response is very difficult. The insolvency problems are very different. It's they're judicial in nature. When you go looking in different countries, the change in Colombia, it worked, or at least they're trying. It's very new, you know, the Chamber of Commerce. They don't have that many cases, so it's difficult to say. It's something new. What can work there might not work somewhere else. I don't think it's the desirable reply that you want to hear, but nevertheless, it's the one I have.
Darío, tienes la mano levantada.
Dario, you have your hand raised. Before giving you the floor, there are the two questions. Let's see if we can answer them all together. As a matter of fact, they are closely related with the first one, because the topic was that in Spain, in order to drop costs, and the question is, do we know that the procedures, it is very common not to have sufficient funds or resources. What will be, what do we do? What can we do to cover the expense of this professional or controller on one hand, and on the other we have the specific one question for Fernando. What would be the difference of the monitoring that was done in the past and one day we think that they did not do and COPE monitored it again? Let's say Darío, if he answers the second part. Yes, I think that from a practical viewpoint in Mexico, that may not be the case in other countries, the financial crisis of systemic that prevailed, we had 4 million micro entrepreneurs. There they are. And because some also small entrepreneur, what to do? My solution could be very simple. And with why don't we a sort of credit to the word in matters of insolvency? I establish a very simple thing, a request of accessing in the crisis of debts, whatever you want to call it. You don't have to do, but a very simple declaration that has no consequences presented in the internet with your that automatically with not having to a standard of insolvencies and the non-execution that you have of the creditors. They don't even, some of them don't even have how to pay. But once you do it, then, and you are going to, you, you're, you're not going to be that. And then through a justification, very simple, formalize a discharge. Here, I forgive you. And what do I want to do? What do you want to do? In wherever you want to do. Well, it's almost impossible in small one, and it's very difficult to find. You don't know where they are. Well, why? Very careful. Well, you cannot do this. The institutionalization of procedures to ensure the effectiveness and transactions in parallel with insolvency. And I will do it very simple. And I will do it scaling from micro enterprises. For the medium size, obviously, I would establish an alternative settlements of disputes. And for the large ones, completely different. But for the medium as companies of formal conflicts, I would facilitate a settlement, what is called the settlement of so that they go of the creditors, because I think that they have bankruptcy procedures. I think that one has to stop to go to the big reality and of a procedure. And I believe that the instrument exists. They are litigators. The lawyer is, no doubt. And the judge gives them a great advance, and we would solve 80% of the cases, those of the 20 are going to go the settlement. Let them go to settlement. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Darío. Bueno,
Thank you
tenemos
very
a
much,
un
Dario.
minuto.
Okay, we are to 1 minute to finish our panel. I would like to give the word to panel, to Fernando.
Fernando, si puede aprovechar Fernando de una vez para hacer su
And after Fernando, I would like to say a few words of closure. And I would like to say, we said, well, sorry, if you want to say something, and we said very, it's logical because all these legislators and all the people in our country to listen the opinions of what we are doing. We never wanted to do it in English. I know that we are going to record it in both languages, so you can access this panel in both languages. Fernando, you have the floor. Thank you very much. On the delegations, I believe one of the reasons that the topic does not have the coverage that we sought is that we wanted to have the close the delegation, but these applied the regulations for general topics. So we had the same problem we always had, the small, medium, and micro enterprises that were using the process, all the considerations that were already mentioned. If we think about this delegation, decentralization, it is not enough to decentralization. One has to process that is appropriate for the dynamic we want to cover. And therefore, I want to have the analogy for Dario, the banquet and the dessert. And I think that is appropriate because sometimes a client and a creditor, I prefer a ending that is horrible than nothing. SME and the micro and the account is there and one has to be looking and calling and generating this fiction. There is something that one has to get still some money to get. No, I have to say, no, this business does not work and there's nothing we are going to get. No money, no, they can't pay and that's it. And let's turn the page and that's it. Let's see what we can do from now on. One of the objectives that one should look at this regime look is one of a settlement. Let's see. It is good or bad or intermediate. There has to be a way so that the creditor and the entrepreneur could turn the page and should go on. One to do business and the other one, yes, to do business too. Thank you very much, and I thank you very much for being able to participate in this panel. Yes, panel. Anybody else? Guillermo, Dario, anybody else wants to say a few words for closure? Yes, Dario. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. I believe that an exhortation to all of us to come back to the analysis of the service of the studies, economic and social studies, that are those that are going to help us find a juridical response, impose a juridical tools that are not always adjusted. The splendid studies of the World Bank and UNCITRAL were specific responses, but tropicalizes like the World Bank's rooting them to the roots, not to impose them because it already has happened to us. I believe that we have to have two regimes, one for the large companies and one for the micro and small companies. Thank you very much, Dario. Luis Mechan. Thank you. Just one thought. Just to go one step forwards, we have to join two spheres and two wills of work. Dario has suggested it. One, what is the will and the technical skill. And that is why we who are dedicated to the finance, economics, corporate, we have to gather it. That is the technical part, but we also have the political, the will of the governments that we have in our countries, the will of the authorities, the will of the non-government organization and the entrepreneurs. We have to join these things so that the technical, juridical, financial, some ideals is joined with the political, social, economical of our country. We have to think about this partnership. These are my last comments. I agree. Thank you very much, Guillermo. Thank you, Rosa Maria. This is just my last comments. Peru has an important debt with the micro and small, medium-sized company. We are talking about 40% of the GDP, and we are referring to the 80% of the Peruvian population, and not having a regime that is talking about the crisis of these population is closing the eyes to an important number of people. And I believe that it is a regime that is covering for an insolvency matter that has to be specific and has to cover a virtuous circle that allows to formalize the companies, give them opportunities, and at the same time, due to this logic, insert them in the formal flow of financing and growth in the country. This is the reflection I wanted to share with you. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you, Guillermo. Andres, would you like to close this session of webinars? Yes, obviously. Thank you, Rosa, very much. Simply, I want to thank the audience for all the patience and the panelists for their brilliant contributions. I believe that we take with us very interesting contributions and experiences with 6 countries, and I believe jointly all of them with the conclusions have come to the point of saying, yes, the micro and small and medium-sized companies are important, and they have been lacking attention. And as Guillermo said for Peru, but I think it is applicable, we are in debt with them in all our countries. We have to think again about them, and I don't remember the word, the exact word that was used. What we should have the adapt them more to our reality, inbred into our philosophy, and I believe then we will be successful, and the persons that are here are the correct ones. And from the World Bank, I want to thank you all and to thank for the AAA for jointly have this 3 webinars. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andres, and exhaust and urging all of us. We took some time to improve the realities of the micro, small, and medium-sized companies. And thank you all for connecting to these webinars. We adjourn this meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all the panelists.